Hey, what's going on? I don't know where to start. Basically, I could possibly start by, let's see, global warming. Um, it's like one of the major topics that is going on around the planet. A lot of people don't really realize. A lot of entities that based around um, a lot of things that goes on around the 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 meaning itself, I guess. I don't know, people kind of get lost from the word global warming. So where could we start, right? I guess I could start by saying first, besides the usage of these mechanical tools that bends energy on the ground, corresponding to the light and the magnetic field that we are present in, um, the the carbon emissions obviously emitted from all of these mechanical tools that we drive and use every day, and or these factories that pollutes our atmosphere, which is a container, and its capacity rate of harnessing light and energy at a rate where it can exchange throughout the cycle of the atmosphere, which is leading from the cycle of the atmosphere to sustaining clear currents, making gravitational waves um, by the currents of the ocean, corresponding to the ocean. This would indicate magnetic flux and or light corresponding to the flux. So the changing of the energy or the bending is how we could like rapidly how do you say we bend the bending the currents or the atmospheric currents where it could make dramatic droughts in areas and not sufficiently supply enough water to the ground. So basically, um, we can start off with an introduction to the atmosphere, I guess, and how could we could basically talk about how, one second, how electrically charged particles and their fundamental forces interact with the atmosphere. Basically, since the energy bent a lot of areas on the ground, it also made a dramatic change to our axial tilt, as our axial tilt shifts corresponding to the core and the melting of the north and the south poles. The stability of the core or the plasma turbulence obviously had a dramatic shift from fundamental forces of nature out of the four states of matter, which was the melting and or the bending of the North Pole and South Pole, which we dramatically encased on from rapidly accelerating with these mechanical tools using um, gas and oil emissions. This was a gravitational force and interaction with our atmospheric cycle, and the charge of the particles, and or these, at the atomic scale, they have a cluster effect as they gather together, and they scoot light, and the light also bends in different areas as this atmospheric cycle continues to happen throughout the magnetism. So, according to the charges in our atmosphere, it would be charges and or discharges. We see the nuclear X-rays all the time, and we see the storms. The storms are magnetic, and they also are visible charge storms that have a current and or specific frequency currents. They make ground contact and or linear contact in our atmosphere. So basically, the nature of these clouds are obviously indicate either um, the applied magnetic field, which would be the clouds, would make a magnetic effect, which would make different types of vacuums, so different types of charges in our atmosphere. These different charges of these small atoms and our with their electronic configurations, which would make their elements and or element identification, would go through these different grayscales or the grayscale matter of the storm and or the clouds. Some of them are charged, some of them are not as charged, some of them are neutral. They're all charged basically because they're a storm and or they produce you know weatherization into our atmosphere. It's a strong interaction and or force, a fundamental force of nature. We see it every day. So the special forces between the carbon emissions and the clustering effect, and how they apparently go to different areas as the charges or the clusters per, um, tend to accumulate from the constant production of carbon emissions from people. We tend to see the magnetic effect that they have with the magnetic field. The magnetic field is completely different with the charged particles. Basically, by the thermal interactions and thermal translations, we would see, the weatherization being changed because they are bending the light and or the heat rays as they enter the atmosphere, and it's either less, dense and or stronger from the bending and or not the presence and or not being present in the area where the heat rays and or um, the magnitude waves are heading. Although the galactic center's magnitude waves makes the heat apparently greater and or stronger no matter the season. Even though the season does make the thermal state from the axial tilt, the what is it called? The magnitude phases of the intergalactic center always can just dynamically heat um, us up at any time, and or a vacuum of space it sustains can obviously sustain a vacuum of temperature drop. But anyways, corresponding to back to Earth, corresponding to the planet and the core, since the polar indications are we'll talk about polar indications. Another introduction. I'm probably jumping ahead too far, in between. Basically, there are a lot of polar excitations. Like we see mountains, we see hills. Those are, great indications of another fundamental force of gravitational interactions with the core, and in crystallization, and different types of currents that arose from the core, making different types of magnitudes, visible magnitudes, which would encase land elevation, was plasma magnitude and or magnitudes, which makes lots of land and formations of elementary type particle like or molecular identifications of elements. Um, so see, these were another interactions of strong forces which created the mountains, obviously. Um, Thus, another aspect of polar high indication of very strong and magnetic field-like interactions would be the mountains. Thus, the North and the South Pole, aspects of mountains. It's another effect of bending the atmospheric quantity of our atmosphere. It bends and curves corresponding to the thermal states. The thermal translations of the mountains are always greatly conducted because they change in temperature dramatically, and since their conductivity of their temperature interactions into a higher depth of the atmosphere from the electronic ground type of interaction with the elements stored inside, is a great indication of astronomical work from mountains. So great at bending energy, great at curving energy. You can visibly see how they bend energy from their charges corresponding to the magnitudes. If plasma, of course, arise these areas, and or a freezing effect happens because of its electronic configuration, you would see the configuration of the mountain at a high peak is interacting with the atmosphere at a very fast and rapid way, and vacuuming too. So back to mathematical productions of the North and the South Pole. Since um, since the South Pole is obviously melting, and the North Pole is obviously going through its nuclear bending phases from a lot of the North Pole using and producing the most carbon emissions. The carbon emission and bending effect of energy would obviously indicate every single country into the north half of the hemisphere, since it's since that would include Europe, China, Russia, um, Japan, America. That's all of the north, and that's the most populated areas of that's the most populated on the planet. And since we are causing most of the bending to the north, we obviously made a shift to our planet rapidly at a faster rate than the turbulence could um, bend different types of stability rates for duration of that plasma phase. Since we're shifting through plasma phases rapidly faster, it would indicate the melting phases of the North Pole, which would indicate a different, trying to harness a different phase of a different plasma phase for us to drive through. Thus, the sustainment obviously has its nuclear interactions, which we see volcanic interactions constantly, earthquake interactions constantly, and tectonic interactions constantly. It can also make massive storms. The duration and or quantity of liquids that's going to be sustained into our oceans. So it's really complex to talk about global warming because there's so many different things that surround it corresponding to light and the forces that are around light which we are surrounding, um, and the shifting tides which would be irregular to what we were around in the past, in which we can enhancedly indicate different types of tools and or dynamical tools that would help us go through different drives of nuclear turbulence phases with our technology in the ocean, under the water, and also in space, and or on mountains. These different types of tools that we could make and or conduct could help vacuum different parts of our atmosphere, either using the ocean, sustaining different types of, um, funnel-like phases in different sectors of the ocean. You know, it's almost like making a let's see, it's almost like making a oil rig, you know, and or a ship, and just like putting I think obviously they all have nuclear tools and nuclear reactors, and it's like just kind of putting it underwater and just turning it into a funnel and like have it vacuum various quantity and or bend various quantities of energy and light. So because water obviously diffracts light constantly, so if we just continuously bend light with the water instead of having it diffract in waves, let's see, the ocean wave light interaction, electrical charges, yeah, obviously release different types of refractions of light and heat, which heats up our atmosphere, and bounce light in different ways. So if we make a vertex in the ocean, we would sustain a different type of energy interaction, which would be a different quantity. And we could talk about that later. I don't want to talk too much because it's going on to almost uh, 14 minutes now. I'm trying to talk fast, so I'm not trying to bore anybody or anything, but these are just different introductions to parts and different things that we could make. I could talk about the other tools later. So it was nice talking. Back to another introduction and another day. Thank you. Thank you.